Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for attending today's webinar. I'm Rachel Woody, and I am joined with Ryan Anthony Donaldson on this one. And Ryan and I are very much looking forward to getting into this discussion because what we're talking about today is future forecasting, the LAM landscape. And just in case you aren't familiar with the LAM acronym, we're talking about libraries, archives, and museums. So let's get into it. So first, who are we? I am Rachel Woody. I own Rachel Christine Consulting, and I'm a firm that works with archives, museums, and cultural heritage organizations. And I am joined by Ryan Anthony Donaldson. Ryan, would you introduce yourself?
Certainly. Thank you, Rachel. So my name's Ryan Anthony Donaldson. I also am a consultant with Heritage Archives and Information Services, and also have my own LLC as well, and I'm pleased to be here. And so in terms of today, we have 6 items that we look forward to covering. First, being able to understand the landscape of what we're seeing and being able to share some of the insights largely drawn from our perspective as consultants. Two, as we put on our future forward hat, where we think things are headed. And this, of course, would be as of August 2021, but being able to provide some insight into what we see ahead of us, which I know some of you may be especially interested in seeking work today and what that means for the industry and being able to share some insight there. And then number 4, really talking about the evolving, shifting identities. This is important to mention because we see it as very tied to seeking employment today. And we will be discussing that a bit more in detail soon. And then the 5th item, being able to provide some consultant tips and advice, again, based on our experience and drawing from the previous 4 items. And then we will leave you with our 6th and final item, some resources that hopefully will be able to help you on your career journey, whether you are seeking work or currently have work going on. Feel free to add your questions and comments in the chat. We look forward to your feedback, and it really aids us in being able to deliver a valuable program based on your interests. It's also important to mention that there is a full screen option. So if you go into your browser window and look for the 4-cornered icon and go ahead and select that, it will enlarge your screen, thus making it a bit easier to be able to see the content.
I also want to do a shout out for accessibility. The webinar we're doing today is auto captioned. And so whether you're watching Premiere or you're watching this as a recording, there are closed captioning available as well in the same menu that Ryan oriented you towards.
Okay, great. So we will start off with the first item in terms of what we're seeing. First, we'll start off with one of the major challenges. As we're now in summer 2021, we're now approaching 2 years of being impacted by COVID-19 along with other global factors. And unfortunately, it's led to closures of cultural institutions. There sadly are many examples, and from what we're seeing for us based in the Pacific Northwest, one we're seeing is with unfortunately, the closure of the Motorsports World of Speed Museum outside of Portland, Oregon in 2020. Katrina O'Brien, the head of archives and collections there, delivered a very powerful presentation at the Northwest Archivist Conference back in May titled Dissolving a Museum's Archives and Collections. And it's very valuable to be able to review that. I believe that presentation has been made available. And really, it's lessons that can be applied at any stage of a cultural institution, no matter where you're at. Maintaining relationships with stakeholders, really being able to update policies and procedures. And then also, I would say, to take a step back, understanding the emotional labor required for an activity like that, especially in managing a team or being a part of a team and working together to be able to deliver on that task. And another example, and this is here locally in Seattle where I'm based, and this is cited partially as a result of the impacts of COVID-19. We witnessed the closure of the Vulcan Arts and Entertainment portfolio, and that includes the Living Computers Museum and Labs, Flying Heritage and Combat Armor Museum, And one of my favorite theaters, the historic Cinerama Theater, all of which included items from the collection and archives of Vulcan founder Paul Allen. We're also seeing a variety of adjacent job titles. Now, some of you may see this for those of you that are job seekers now, and so kind of compiled just a short list of some of the things that we're seeing. We're seeing titles such as project manager, information technology manager, program coordinator, digital asset manager, digital asset coordinator, content strategist, and the majority of these have some form of the word content, asset, or especially digital in there somewhere. And we introduced this just to encourage all of you that are looking for work to be mindful of that in your search. A lot of you may have already seen that. Sometimes those terms are really outside of the control of the hiring manager, or could be something that's a requirement based on the project or the grant. And so just to keep that in mind as you're looking, but it really can be a word salad sometimes in terms of those, but really the responsibilities remain the same. And then finally, we have the onset of hybridized roles. Part of that also was related to the impact of COVID-19. For instance, one thing we've seen is only essential folks that are designated as essential staff only being allowed on site. So in some cases, having facility staff being on site and doing some of the archives work, because unfortunately, some of those workers that are termed as archivists may not be allowed to be on site because of not having that essential worker designation. If we move on here, there's a very interesting example that I'd like to just briefly touch on. This is a screenshot from a Twitter post from Ellen Cushing. Ellen is the special projects editor of The Atlantic, and this is a job post that is for a archivist historian role. And this is a temporary role, and it's to support the Inheritance Project, which has an aim to, quote, be a project about American history, Black life, and the resilience of memory, with part of the purpose to center Black American writers and contributors. What I found interesting about it was actually some of the responses to this initial post. As some of you in the audience may be thinking of, is looking at an archivist and looking at a historian traditionally as being very different roles. Yet in this particular case, they're asking for competencies in both to be able to effectively deliver on the objectives of the job. So I think that's something also that we would encourage you all to be thinking about as well, is this idea that a lot of what we're seeing may be tied to specific projects or initiatives, and to be aware that part of the job seeking process may be having conversations with hiring managers, with employers, about really what that entails, and the idea that some of these descriptions may not be written in stone and may be subject to further revision based on how some of those conversations go.
Yeah, I think that's such an excellent point, Ryan. With this one post, I think it resonated throughout our field and the historian field. I think because it hit on so like several issues that both of the fields have experienced in terms of misunderstanding fundamentally of what it is that we do as archivists or historians, as well, of course, as the problematic view of only just now prioritizing Black voices and having that viewed as a temporary role versus a permanent role, which I know we're going to get into some more in just a moment here. But yeah, this is such an excellent example because it did happen so recently, and I think taps into several of those issues that we as, both archivists and historians need to have some tough conversations on.
Absolutely.
So Ryan found very recently another job posting for us to talk about. And Ryan, as this was your find, I want to give you the floor first, but for our audience who has joined us today, Ryan and I have agreed to do sort of like a live dissection of this job post. And talking about what we're seeing here in terms of this is a trend moving forward, or this is something new, this is something we're optimistic about, or this is something we're concerned about. So just sort of providing our observations and insight and applying it very specifically to this particular case study. So with that, I'll have you start first, Ryan.
Thank you, Rachel. This very much is a recent posting. In fact, it was posted just today. It is a archivist role for physical assets in archives. And one thing that's interesting is, unlike some of the job postings that we've seen, this is one that has as a requirement to be on site. We've seen a number of examples, and I think there's a lot of examination around the amount of time that an archivist is required to be on site, to be able to manage a collection. And so this is one that really gets more to that traditional idea of, as it says in the title, managing the physical assets of the company. We're also seeing a heavy concentration around digital asset management as well. Those are some of the core responsibilities. Looking at the first four of the bullet points, they all speak to that in some way. What I find interesting about this is that it's kind of a blend of what would be more of a traditional kind of archivist role with achieving what seems to be some strong digital asset management that looks like it will not only support Netflix in an external customer facing way, but also internally as it relates to content strategy, potentially even taxonomy work.
Hmm. Yes, all excellent points. I think I'll start off with the digital part of this. This post is enormous to me. Enormous in terms of the title is quite literally physical assets, but as Ryan pointed out, there's a significant portion devoted to the digital assets as well in terms of what the roles would be responsible for. And then there's also this enormity in terms of it's starting a new archive program
Mm-hmm.
for a humongous organization with many, many, many assets. And it's not only setting it up, but like needing to set up the digital infrastructure of which you would put the digital assets into. One of these is also saying, I believe you're able to hire and train a team to come in and help, which
Mm-hmm.
I was glad to see in terms of like, this is more than a one person job. But what I noticed was that it didn't actually call out that this role would be a managerial role. And
Mm,
so one of
yes.
my concerns as someone who has established several archival programs is not only like the sheer scope of this, but also the complete lack of acknowledgement of like, yes, we want you to get and train people, but no, we're not going to actually acknowledge that in terms of you being a manager, which is usually a way companies use as a strategy to not pay you appropriately in terms of what your actual responsibilities are. So that's something that I'm concerned about that I see here, that I would recommend to whoever may be applying or interviewing that that is something that you ask them about. I think some of the other things, Ryan, and I'd love to get your take on the qualifications part. I was happy to see knowing that this is going to be like a complete setup job for the physical and the digital stuff, that they're asking for at least 7 years of experience in archival management. Um, what I'm interested in is that they're not referencing like the digital certification that
Mm.
SAA offers. There's other than sort of name dropping MLS as maybe a particular degree. I didn't see sort of anything else that indicated that they were looking for any specific technical qualifications. What's your read on that?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And thank you for your analysis as well. Excellent point regarding centering and recognizing the importance of the management role. And really, it's tied to this whole program being successful. And in my mind, I think that would be something very significant to have explicitly stated here. To get to the next point, I did see this idea of a strong understanding of digital asset management systems, both front and back end, and the willingness to learn a new one and another one.
Mhm.
Is there existing digital asset management system? Is there going to be a migration from one that's being deprecated? And if that's the case, it'd be great then to kind of see some further expectations from on a technical level of what they're looking for there.
Right.
And going in and if one had the opportunity to interview, highly encourage being able to have some of those things be discussed. And then one thing that's kind of in the back of my mind too, getting back to the managerial point, is are those roles going to be outsourced with another consultancy? And because that would then impact how the management process would work. It could even impact the access to the material. So all of those things coming into play. You raised the case well there, Rachel, about wondering more about some of the competencies as it relates to digital asset management, and in particular where the title says physical assets. It just makes me wonder how those two are weighted in the organization, and any opportunity to have a follow up conversation, kind of understanding how that balance plays out.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. Another thing that I wonder that your point had reminded me of is this qualification down here: a strong understanding of digital asset management systems, which great, both front and back end. And then in parentheses, a very odd note and a willingness to learn a new one and another new one. And so for me, it's like, do you have systems already? And if you do, name them, because that
Mm-hmm.
would be tremendously more informative for the people who are applying in terms of like, oh yes, I do have experience using that system, or no, but I am familiar and can learn, kind of thing. Or is this a note that sort of indicates a thought process, which I see a lot as a consultant working with clients who aren't as familiar with digital management systems and collections management systems, where they're, instead of having a strategy to have one system to help do all of your things, there's an approach where you get multiple systems that do just one thing very well, which I find the latter approach, while laudable in terms of wanting the right tools for the job, if you are just one person, which so far you would be if you get this job until you hire a team, and you're implementing multiple systems, that's a red flag for me in terms of like capacity, also what is the budget, and like how are you going to make them all talk to each other? Like those are all questions I have. Which with Netflix, I would hope that they would actually give whoever is setting up this archives a very healthy budget. But
Mm-hmm.
that was just something that stuck out with like, what are you trying to say here?
Excellent point, Rachel.
Well, any other thoughts, Ryan, before we wrap up our dissection of this particular post?
I would just say, in summary, and certainly, I think this is something for us to celebrate. Being
Yeah,
able to have such a high visibility role, be able to consider what might be a domino effect of this as well for other similar companies to be thinking, well, hey, maybe we need that too, because Netflix is this recognized industry leader. So, being able to all share in this to celebrate the fact that this is a position that perhaps could lead to other opportunities for us in the field.
absolutely. Yeah, as you said, Ryan, this is a good post for, even though I had things to offer commentary on, this is one of the better posts I have seen
Hmm.
coming from a company that doesn't have an archives background or integration. So yes, this is great. They're using the right language, even though there's a couple things we have questions on. It is clear that they either have someone or talk to somebody to knowledgeably put this post together. I think my only other recommendation for Netflix, not that they're watching this webinar, but for all of you as well, for if and when you do put job posts out, do please put the salary on there, especially for a job like this where it is going to be a managerial role. You are setting up an archives program and you're based in Los Angeles, California. Like those are all things that require a lot of experience and education, and you want a skilled person. And if you want those people to consider and apply for your job, they're going to need to see what the salary is to see if it's a good fit. And for those of you who do want to apply to this job, which, like, I don't blame you, it would be awesome to get, do look up the cost of living for Los Angeles, California, compare that to the living wage and compare that to other jobs in and around the area in terms of what sort of the median salary range is, so that you can go in knowledgeably when you have that salary conversation with Netflix or whomever you're interviewing with. I do have a webinar that I'll link to that helps lead you through the calculating your worth. But yes, for those posting jobs, put the salary on there. And for those applying for jobs, don't be afraid to ask for it because nobody wants to waste their time if it's a bad match. So that's end of preach. Well, thank you for indulging me in that live dissection, Ryan. I really appreciate you giving your thoughts and being so thoughtful about it.
Anytime, Rachel.
All right, well, to move us along, we are going to continue getting into some of the changes and what we're seeing. As we know, the global economy, the global workforce, and the increase due to COVID of remote work. I mean, we were already starting to operate at a global capacity pre-pandemic in terms of things that would happen in other countries, current events, catastrophes, etc., would have an impact on our economy and vice versa. Also, with the tools and technology that we have available, being able to work more easily and globally is something that we were already seeing in application. Maybe not as much in the archives field, but certainly for any job sector, being able to employ a global workforce was becoming a more common idea. And then, of course, with the global pandemic, we have seen the forced embrace of remote work. And for those who can work from home in these last 18 months, that has, I think, shown to a lot of people that it is not only possible, but in many cases preferred. Preferred for productivity on the business strategy solution side, and also preferred for people who have lives that they're trying to live that have been impacted by the pandemic. So, for many reasons, remote work has become not only a requirement for the situation, but also something that I think is going to be with us moving forward. And I think there's a strong business case for that, as well as a human case for that. I mean, we are all people with families and people that we care about, with situations that extend far beyond work that we need to deal with and in order to live our lives. So we were already seeing that, and then we saw like a dramatic increase. Now, for my next bullet point, with that in mind, we are starting to see a huge increase in what is being termed by a lot of the business sector as the Great Resignation. And this is essentially a phrase that is being used to describe this sort of mass exodus of workforce from companies who are choosing not to continue remote or flexible work options. And the sort of shared consensus almost in terms of after the last 18 months that we just endured, and knowing that we're not out of it yet in terms of the pandemic, at least, the in seeing companies and organizations that just like really aren't acknowledging the trauma that has happened, the human costs that we're still paying right now with the pandemic, that sort of bad decision making and tone deafness on those companies and organizations part has been enough to lead many people to quit their jobs. So it has been happening these last few months, and I think we're going to continue to see this increase in people leaving the workforce, especially since, because we're in a global economy, like people can work anywhere now thanks to technology. So that there are tons of job options for these people leaving their jobs. It's going to be fascinating to see, and especially as it pertains to the archives as a field, I am very curious how we'll see that Great Resignation impact us or not, given the sort of the hybridness of our roles typically with working with physical collections, but also so much of what we do now is digital. And then the last thing I want to talk about, it was sort of related to thinking about the workforce, but individually as us as humans, we are starting to see the increase in demand for transparency from companies and organizations, and specifically transparency around compensation and benefits. So, we talked about the Netflix posting and how it didn't have any mention of salary or benefits, and how that makes it increasingly difficult for those who are looking for a job to spend any amount of time putting a thoughtful application together because they don't actually know if the salary is actually going to work for them and their family and their situation. So I think we're starting to, in general, just see this fed upness of traditional practices in all of the fields in terms of not being transparent on compensation and how we're just not taking it anymore. And so we're starting to increasingly see in the museum and archives field statements coming out from professional organizations saying if they are not requiring, they're at least strongly recommending that salary ranges or salary statement be posted. And so I think, Ryan, that we're going to continue seeing that as we move forward, especially with things like the Great Resignation happening. I think that's just more fuel to the fire. I would love to hear your thoughts, though, if you have any before I move on.
Absolutely. I think to that last point, Rachel, one thing in collections work is really the history and legacy of the hidden labor involved in it. So I think part of this demand comes from trying to surface the value of that work and to be more transparent about it. I've been really encouraged by colleagues, and it's something that I've explored as well, is trying to make more of that work visible by being in the paradigm of remote work. And so, what I mean by that is, I've seen some really great examples of being able to do a virtual archives tour, being able to do segments to do a quick minute or two on some highlights of the collection that can approach outreach again, show show the value of what we're doing kind of in a way that hadn't been thought about before, or perhaps was maybe a secondary consideration. So I think, again, to that point, been kind of a bedrock of circumstances that have kind of created that, in addition to just the very strong equity element that also is very important in this consideration and that you touched on, Rachel.
Mhm. Excellent. Thank you for adding that. Moving us along, we're going to get into the next section now titled Where We're Headed. And so this is Ryan and I taking what we've observed and what we're seeing as consultants in the industry and doing some forecasting in terms of where we might be headed. So I believe I will start us off with this one. Some of these points are major pain points, and so I do want to make sure that we address these. What we have been seeing thus far and where I think we may be headed is an increased absorption of traditional collections work, excuse me, into broader roles. And so I know that's something that Ryan touched on, especially as we talked about the Atlantic example and some of the job posts that we're starting to see now. And especially with COVID, with funding being so precarious, and then even more so after, with the pandemic, there is this broader amalgamation of, okay, so collections are collections. So if we have a museum with an archives, then the curator can just manage both of them. Like they're both collections. Somebody at the administrative level has made that decision for better or worse, that maybe they could just have that hybrid role. Um, that is obviously concerning for us who are specialized professionals who understand that there's a difference between a curator and an archivist and a registrar and a digital asset manager and what have you. But with organizations having awful budgets and not being financially sound, we are, I think, unfortunately going to continue seeing the absorption of that type of work. And so that is something that I want you and all of us to be aware of as we're looking at the field and seeing that happen. I don't have a solution for it yet, but I think the first step is to make sure that we know it's happening and that it is a problem, and maybe it's something we can start working on for a solution. Another trend that I am seeing that will continue and perhaps get worse is an increase in project-based temporary position and grant-funded work. This, with our field not being robust financially, like that has never been the case. There has always been the existence of grant-funded projects or temporarily funded positions as and when a little bit of a financial bucket may be made available to the archives. But unfortunately, this has only increased in terms of analyzing the jobs that have been available over these last few years compared to even 10 years ago. The majority of them these last few years have only been temporary or project based versus a permanent full time position. And that's concerning because it's not healthy for those organizations to continually go through temporary positions and then losing people and then maybe not having somebody and then another temporary position. Like, that's not good for consistent collections care and management. But it's also incredibly economically exploitive to the workforce and the people in our field to expect them to string together a variety of temporary project-based work. It's not sustainable for them. You know, they can't buy a house or have a family on that kind of salary. And typically, when they are temporary or project based, there isn't the additional compensation of like healthcare benefits or a retirement plan or daycare for children kind of thing. So if they're lacking some basic benefits as well as not getting great pay because it's temporary and project based, it's not good. It's not a good human decision and it's not a good organizational decision. And so this is another thing I want us to be incredibly aware of. I think some of the emerging solutions, one of which is being transparent with salaries. Another is to make sure that we hold accountable not just the organizations, but the granting agencies that are giving these awards, because in essence, if they are funding a position that is not substantial enough to actually be the value of that work, then we're basically allowing them to dictate what that value is, and it's not enough. So I think we need to do some more advocacy work there. And then the last thing that I want to talk about on this particular subject is we're starting to see work tied to initiatives rather than specific collections. And what I mean by that is, especially in these last few years, as we start to, or at least recommit to doing hard work in terms of making sure that our collections are truly representative and making sure that we're elevating voices that haven't typically been invited to the historical record or the table. We are seeing initiatives to address this, and I think that is great in terms of addressing. Where I am concerned, though, is that initiatives such as diversity, equity, and inclusion, when I see those types of projects and I see initiative attached to it, to me, that communicates a temporary sense that this is something temporary to focus on. Whereas I would argue the recommitment to being accurate with the historical record and inviting more people to the table to tell their story, that is a lifestyle change. Being more diverse and inclusive is a lifestyle change, is not a trend. It is not something we're doing just for now as an initiative. So I would like all of us to think about that as we move forward in how we're talking about performing that work and what is or is not a temporary job versus a permanent programmatic change. I know that was quite a lot, Ryan, but do you have anything you'd like to add to that before we continue?
I think all of that was very important matters to think about. I'll just add a few quick elements as well. One of the things that, as we were preparing for this webinar, that we looked at was what are some kind of foundations to understand the employment sector overall. And so one of the things we researched into was the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. They have a category for archivists, curators, and museum workers. And granted, this was a projection done in 2019, but one thing that was a bit surprising was a prediction of an increase, an 11% growth rate from 2019 to 2029 for our sector, whereas the average growth rate across all sectors is 4%. So that's something like 37,500 jobs that would be well over 40,000 in the next 8 years. And so the reason I bring this up is this was, of course, before the impacts of COVID-19. But on the other hand, I think it also dovetails with what Rachel's talking about, where how much of that work is sustainable. The last statistic that really raised eyebrows for me was that for 2019 numbers, they were saying the average salary was $52,140 per year which comes out to about $25 an hour. And as Rachel talked about earlier, how does that compare to living in Los Angeles now? In New York City, increasingly in cities that are becoming more expensive as well. And that typically is where the job centers are, drawing that magnet of us to be able to have those positions. That's one piece. And then the last piece being, what does it mean for these temporary roles in a profession that is about legacy, in a profession that is about long-term thinking? The collections that we've inherited have been maintained in our mind for a long time, but really the mission, really the drive of what we do is that collections care, is that management into perpetuity as we understand it. So to have these roles be defined as temporary, how do we find consistency in that to be able to ultimately achieve what it is that we're charged to do?
Yes, absolutely. I think one of the other points that Ryan, you and I had discussed previously were, touching on that grant funded aspect. And especially when you have a grant funded diversity and inclusion initiative, we've been seeing, especially over this last year, major granting agencies start a new set aside of funding for community archives. And we're seeing it done in a variety of different ways. Ryan, I know you mentioned Mellon is one of the major ones, most recently funding community archives. And I do love that they put the emphasis on the community themselves being the ones that apply and receive and can administer that money. I love that it gives them the agency to lead that, rather than somebody from the outside having to forcing to come in, or however that may happen. I know we've seen it the other way too, in terms of organizations are all of the sudden charged with all of a sudden doing a community initiative, and it is questionable in terms of execution. But when we're looking at those granting opportunities, one of the other ones that has come up, Library of Congress just did a temporary funding call for community archives. But when you apply for federal funding, as some of you may be aware, you have to go through grants.gov, which also means that you have to go through the certification for that. And it's intense. And if you don't already have an account, then you're already behind by several weeks. And it's such an intensive application process that if you're setting aside money for a community that hasn't had the ability to access this money before, who probably doesn't have the accounts in place or the staff who know how to put the accounts in place to even apply for these grants, it really does concern me in terms of, we're making this money available, but it is only in a temporary fashion, and it is only through the traditional granting mechanisms that already put up so many barriers. Like there's already an equity deficit here in terms of who can apply for those, who has the capacity and knowledge to apply for those. So I know that's getting us a bit off topic, but was there anything that I missed, Ryan, or that you wanted to share on that point?
Well, I think you expressed it quite well. It's laudable to the attention and the focus and the centering of projects that are extremely important, looking at what the Mellon Foundation is stating for the community-based archives program. To touch on what you mentioned a moment ago, really the heart of it is looking at, and this is drawing from the call for proposals, activation and advocacy efforts, including resident community activist archivist positions, ethical preservation of social media, and increased community use of archives. So again, all of these goals are great, but I think speaking to the point that you raised, Rachel, how can that really be made central to the organization? How can we be at a point where it's not always dependent on trying to get the resources to align with the other institutional program? So that sense of going from an initiative to a program, meaning that it's regular, there's an expectation of resources along with an overall larger strategic plan to be able to support that for the future.
Yes. Yep. Well said. All right, now we're going to shift into seeking work today. And Ryan and I have both got some strategies that we're looking forward to talking about. And so I'm going to take the first couple points, and then I know Ryan's going to join me on the second half. But when we're thinking about searching for work, there's the obvious in terms of, setting up your job search, setting up job alerts, etc. But I do want to talk about some different strategies that you can employ in addition to that. So, the first one I want to talk about is raising the awareness of yourself and of yourself as a brand and activating your social capital. And so, what I mean by that is boosting your profile, so to speak, in terms of letting people know that you're out there as a professional, talking about projects that you have worked on, activating that social capital in terms of who do you have connections with. And it's not just about the networking, which I know we have all heard as a strategy for trying to find work, but really thinking about where your relationships are, where those people are in terms of organization in the field, where they are in their career, and really being thoughtful in terms of who is a part of your network and what parts of that network does it make sense to reinvest your time and energy to maintain relationships and perhaps to start or renew relationships and increase your social capital. And I do want to note here that this is not just about you and what you can get from those people by activating your social capital. I would, in fact, encourage you to do the reverse, especially if you're looking for a job. What is it that you can offer them? How can you support or boost those people? How can you give them some of your social capital so that it can then be reciprocated? So don't go in for it asking, go into it supplying, and then perhaps there can be some mutual benefit. The other thing I want to talk about is increasing your sphere of influence. So we talked about raising the awareness of yourself as a professional, getting, activating your relationships. And I want you to think about taking that one step further and growing your sphere of influence by participating on panels, getting your name out there with articles or blog posts, contributing to community forums, whether that is in an official capacity or a Facebook group. For example, the Archivist Think Tank Facebook group is fairly active. And while I am not as active or periodically active, I do see people's names come up frequently, and I do notice who is contributing to the discussion. How are they contributing? Are they sharing knowledges and resources? What is it that those people are doing, and how that is impacting how they are perceived and what influence they have? So that's another thing I want you to think about. Even if you're new to the field, you do have your own thoughts and perceptions, observations, etc. Like, bring that to the conversation and start growing your own sphere of influence, because I guarantee you I am not the only person paying attention to who's showing up where. So definitely play around with that, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised of the connections that you develop and of the opportunities that may come up from that.
Those are a series of excellent points, Rachel. As we look at the next point here, really what it boils down to is you'll never quite know where and how far the sphere of influence draws out towards.
Mm.
And as a result of that, everything from the job application and hiring process to being able to contribute your own content and being able to participate in these forums, all of that, that's a constellation of factors where you'll never quite know who may see that or may see you appearing again, contributing to a conversation, and then thinking, that's the best person for this job. And both Rachel and I have discussed this before, that we have had consulting opportunities that have arisen from situations we never would have ever anticipated. And the idea that we are in this blended environment where work and social spheres have really come together. And it's something to acknowledge, and it's something to understand where your level of comfort is in this. But as you look for work, to consider how those could come together in ways that, again, that you feel is your authentic self, but also promotes your brand and being able to get your name further out there. So I really think about it as kind of planting seeds everywhere. Anecdotally, it was interesting. I was sitting outside the other day, and next to me, unbeknownst to me, was a group interview for a clothing store, and it was a group interview. It was the first interview with three individuals, and the hiring manager was there. The second question was, how do you live the brand? And what they meant by that was essentially, what do you do outside of work, and how does that reflect this lifestyle brand, that we have? And I found it interesting how that kind of climbed near the top, and just to kind of hear the different answers and responses. And as you have a passion, because it's a passion that brought me into the field, and I would say the same is true for you, Rachel, sharing those experiences, sharing exhibitions that are meaningful to you, being able to talk about, and this comes across with the Facebook group that Rachel was mentioning, being able to share, because there was one, I believe, recently about hanging racks and displays. What was some of the best examples that you've seen? Sharing those things can really resonate with others, and then be able to have you be more front of mind when some of these opportunities occur. And also, as a parting thought on this, the idea that not all jobs are posted. So you may find yourself in a positive scenario where an opportunity comes to you from the energy that you've put out into the world and the content that you've created. So really, to that last point, that's something aligned with this, which is there are a lot of different avenues to be able to land that job, whether it's a dream job or a daydream job, or something in the middle, and that it can be a path that almost can defy logic for how you're able to do that. But the consistency of showing your interest, the consistency of showing up at events, whether virtual, or as we are allowed in person, all can kind of contribute to the job seeking.
Hmm. Yes, and I think the only thing that I would add to that is there's the traditional, what I would term bad advice in terms of like, oh, volunteer for free and then a job might come up kind of advice, which is not realistic for many cases. So we're not saying like be creative and volunteer for free. Like I don't think that's either of our recommendations. But one of, I think, my more approved strategies, or something that I think is at least more healthy for everybody involved, is if you are a person who needs to make a certain amount of money in order to live and support yourself and or your family, it is okay if you have a degree that you are not using because you need to have a job that pays you what you need for the moment. I've seen some post and some angst about people who feel bad or feel shame around getting the degree but then not getting like a job in the field per se. And I would actually reframe that as, you're getting a job for now to survive and make it through this period while you apply and work towards getting that job in the field. So instead of volunteering for free or feeling bad that you're not in the field, like I think that is a totally appropriate strategy and realistic strategy to have. So that's one of, I think, the things we mean in terms of being creative, is creative in how you're framing it as well. Get that for now job as you work towards the dream job kind of thing. Another thing that I would recommend is, especially if you can't afford to take a job in the field right now, having a job that has translatable skills, as Ryan and I talked about, in terms of like job adjacency, so that you're still working on those skills and keeping them fresh. And then you're also gaining other very beneficial skills you could bring with you into the field. So I think that is part of what we mean by thinking about it creatively and finding strategies that work for you, instead of just the very glib like volunteer or be an unpaid intern, because that's never good advice. Okay, Ryan, I think we're moving into shifting identities now.
Yes. And some of this, I think we touched on, earlier in our discussion, and we just want to recognize and highlight the fact that as we are continuing to experience the impacts from the pandemic, as we talked about earlier, as it's leading to closures, as it's leading to these hybridized roles, as it's leading to not even be able to be in the presence of the collections that we're tasked with managing, there is a lot of emotional and mental impact to that. And in a previous webinar, we had advocated for being able to find that peace and well-being, and to have that be a part of not only the if you're in a current position, but in the job seeking as well, because it can be very taxing. You can get a sense of the doldrums for sure. And so, as we introduce this section, kind of be thinking of the changes that you're experiencing and be paying attention to those. And this idea that, as Rachel had talked about the great resignation, how this can be an evolution for yourself in terms of your career too. As we think about everything from where we're working, what we're working on, how we want to consider our own identities within that. And so earlier we talked about the overlap, the Venn diagram of your professional life and social life. You kind of pay attention to that again for what makes sense to you and to kind of apply and ration, accordingly. And so part of that, I know we touched on this before, but again, there are parallels in other industries right now that I think are very instructive for us to look at. I know we touched on this in a previous webinar as well. I would encourage you to look at some of the industries that were heavily and initially and fundamentally impacted by COVID-19. Here I'm thinking of hospitality industry, the travel industry, because in some ways they're kind of our future forecasters. They're further along in this process for what is impacted every possible sector of work that can be imagined. So where there are insights, I know there's a lot of really great webinars and free and low cost resources that are made available. There's even those that are sharing kind of their journey along the way as they experiencing these things. And there's a few accounts that we can add to the resources to look to as a way of kind of understanding that. And then coming to this last point, this is something that I find very interesting, especially as someone that came about as an accidental archivist or kind of came into the field maybe in a bit of a non-traditional way, and that is considering your identity within the context of the collection you're managing. And so for me, it comes down to linguistics. The idea of feeling such a connection to the collections and archives that you're managing, that you're saying that it's yours. And I just ask you to pay attention to that, because I do think there are potential mental impacts in having that mindset, especially when there's challenges to being able to do that, very practical challenges, or in some ways, I would say unavoidable, insurmountable challenges to doing that. And another reason to offer that too is to offer more kind of broad-based, inclusive language about collections, because I think that's also a very good way to consider the job hunt and looking for positions. So as much as there's a sense of identifying with the material, especially if you have a subject matter interest in the collections that you are being tasked with or that you're seeking to work for, just paying attention to that and how that may play into perception of self. And, this idea of how can the collections benefit everybody? How can the collections have a shared sense of ownership? How can the collections be embraced, or just even to raise the awareness for communities that have no idea about this material for many, many reasons, with access and equity being very much tied to that as well. So those are some things that we have thought of in regards to that. We just see it as really fundamental to these changes that we're seeing, and is a large part of the process of seeking work today.
I love that you've made this human centric, like we are humans first and foremost, and how to continually come back to that as we approach our work, as we approach our relationship with the collections, our colleagues, our field. I think the more we can do that and sort of evaluate what it is that we're dealing with, challenges and opportunities with a human centric approach, I think all of us would be a lot better off. And I just wanted to like underscore and reemphasize your point about these last 18 months and then some, in terms of it being hard to varying degrees for everybody. A lot of people are still carrying and experiencing trauma from the current events of these last few years. So just to really move into this next year, and especially if you're going into the job search, which is an incredibly personal activity to try and go through, and applying yourself and putting yourself out there and being vulnerable, just recognizing that and the emotional mental work attached to that and where you are with your own mental health. I'm a huge proponent for getting mental health support. And especially these last 18 months, many of us have uh, have been diagnosed belatedly with different mental or a neurotypical disorders. So just know that everybody is going through it. And especially if you're in the process of seeking a job, definitely give yourself the grace and support you need to do that.
And so as we come to these points, I think they, relate quite closely to some of what we've said so far. Really this idea of kind of viewing things within your specific worldview to looking more largely, and in particular for the job seeking process, really encouraging empathy for potential employers. Just as Rachel had said, we're all, the past 18 months have portended so much that's impacted everybody. It can become very habitual to think about those impacts personally, with your family, with your friends, with those that are within your community. But let's not lose sight of that when we apply for work. Let's be thinking about that for hiring managers. Let's be thinking about that for human resources and talent management staff. Let's be thinking about that for recruiters as well. Another very important aspect. Certainly in our consulting work, we both try to approach each of our projects with that grace, because we don't know necessarily where the organization is at, where the employees are at that you're communicating with. And the reason I bring this up in a practical level is, in applying for a position and not hearing back in a certain amount of time, to not take it as a personal reflection, to not take it as, the job went to somebody else, but there could be internal factors you may not be aware of. And so what I'd advocate here is, for lack of a better way of saying it, kind of a patient persistence, being able to maintain a cadence that can seem right in terms of showing your interest in the role, showing your dedication to pursuing that opportunity, but also again being able to take that step back and understand some of the other factors outside of your control, that may be at play for this hiring process. To the next point, certainly promoting industry success. Let's toot some horns. And let's really try to, again, look to where there is the success and to be able to promote it. So promoting the work of colleagues online, whether through LinkedIn, social media. In October, we have National Archives Month coming up, which is a terrific opportunity to be able to highlight, the work that we do professionally. Again, those are things that overall are related to the health of the industry, but also could have more immediate impacts as you're looking for work. And then in terms of the next point, which we've touched upon a few times, really looking at what are things that can be adapted to the work that you're doing now. What are strategies for potential industries and sectors where there was a huge deficit in hiring for a long period of time? For those that were impacted, what did they do? What were strategies they had around it? Those are things definitely to keep in mind through this process. And then on this final point, really, I know there was a lot of kind of early talk during the what I'll say was the initial stage of the pandemic. I remember seeing things about now's an opportunity to reinvent yourself. And we're not necessarily advocating jumping, being fully into that, but just looking at what are some, because there's so many excellent resources that are out there. Again, a lot available free, low cost, to be able just to adapt those to your schedule as you have the time and opportunity, because there is so much that we can learn from each other. And ultimately, that will get to this overall investment in yourself. And as we have the main topic of this section being this idea of our own self-awareness and understanding how we change, being able to grab onto some of those resources and see how they'll resonate personally, and then how that can be reflected back out there and outward as you're looking for work.
Hmm. Yeah, investing in yourself is never a bad idea. So if you've got the time, space, capacity, or otherwise to pick something up, even if it's just like a quick 1 hour webinar, or if you sign up for a full course, like whatever it is you have room for, if you can invest in yourself, you can then take that with you wherever you go. So I wholeheartedly love that strategy. All right, I think we're leaving them with some tips.
Yes, tips and resources. Absolutely. Yeah, so these are just three quick tips that touch on and help kind of summarize a bit what we have talked about today. So the first one, complement, not compete. in the job application process, part of the mindset is very competitive. I think a lot of us have probably spent time of thinking who else is applying for this job, what skills and abilities do they have, how do I match up? And certainly those are natural thoughts, and certainly those are things to think about. And I think there's some positives for those types of considerations. If you get fully immersed in that, it can be overwhelming, and ultimately it becomes one of those scenarios where you'll never fully know. So that can, as we think of kind of mental well-being and health, I think that sometimes can have some unfortunate negative aspects. Another way to think about this and to apply it more directly is the idea that sometimes path to yes is a bunch of no's. There are some, as I think of the business archives community, some other sectors as it relates to archives, part of the career path is to apply several times to that institution with the thought that that is a path to be able to land a position by showing a dedicated perseverance to the role, and also as part of this longer evaluative criteria. This idea of trying to maintain a very positive outlook, even if it can be a struggle, if it can be challenging, and this idea that the job application process could be a wider lens than you may be anticipating or what you're being told. To be able to maintain that perspective, I think, can be really helpful. Number two, Rachel noted this before in terms of automating your search. I know I'm talking to a fair amount of information management professionals, so I imagine a lot of you are aware of the tools and resources to be able to have alerts. Google Alerts is one of many. We would encourage you to combine maybe some of the searches you're already doing with some of the adjacency terms, that we've noted before. And I think really to think about how you'll want to focus your energy. I know there's a proactive way of looking on job boards, being able to look at listservs, looking at wonderful sites such as Archives Gig, which can aggregate that, but also encouraging being able to have some of the targeted information or some of the background research you want to do on a role be able to come to you. And so again, there's a plethora of those resources out there, some of which you all may have some wonderful expertise in, but really encouraging you to kind of then have that be a filter for thinking about your job search and career. And then to the next point, I know, Rachel, this is something that you've spoken well to and have been able to talk to, but really the idea of capturing the essence of your skills.
Yeah, I mean, when you're looking at the job posts, like when we looked at the Netflix job posts together, there are so many of us in the field that have 7+ years experience, have archives management experience, like we tick the boxes. So to individualize yourself, capturing the essence of your skills beyond those check marks, I think could be incredibly beneficial, especially when you consider the cover letters that you need to write, which is supposed to be how you introduce yourself as an individual, and talk about, I believe the term is dragon slaying stories for your cover letter. Like you're supposed to talk about a dragon slaying story of like how you were awesome at something. So what is it that you do that you just kick butt at, and like really helps to capture the essence of who you are as an archivist and what you bring to the collection and the work that you do. And I not only is that great to think of yourself in those specific terms, but it's also incredibly helpful to the people who are trying to find their person to work with. So I encourage people to think and brainstorm on that creatively, in terms of how you first identifying that and then communicating it. And Ryan, just quickly before we move on, I just wanted to underscore the point you made of the complement, not compete. And I think especially when we're in like job hunting mode, and even us as consultants, I think the traditional framework used to be if you're applying for the job, then you're in competition. But that doesn't exclude you being on the same team. Now, if it's a sports metaphor, that doesn't work, obviously, but it's like, yes, we could both be putting in a job application or a proposal or something for the same job, but we're also on the same team. And Ryan, that's partly why I enjoy working with you so much, is that even though we may be in competition for certain jobs, we're also on the same team in terms of we're both consultants in the field. we're both leaders in this industry, and especially in the Pacific Northwest, and that there's so much good we can do together when we're on the same team, even though we might be in competition in a couple areas. So I just wanted to highlight like the benefits of like you can be in competition, that's not a bad thing, but just also make sure that you don't lose sight of being on the same team.
That was beautifully said, Rachel, and I completely agree. To go further with that sports metaphor and thinking about the recent Olympics, I mean,
Mhm. Yeah.
there can be team events and also individual ones, but ultimately it's to better everybody. And you have inspired me, Rachel, with the work you've done. You've given, wonderful ideas about how to approach certain challenges. And so that's something we share. And I think, to be able to think about that more broadly,
Mhm.
even when you're doing the job seeking, which can feel very adversarial, is something to definitely keep in mind. And also, just to say, it is still, relatively speaking, a small field. So,
Yeah.
someone so someone that you may feel competitive against may be the hiring manager, or you may be the hiring manager down the line. So that's also something to keep in mind too.
Yes, 100%.
Okay, so we have covered a lot of material today. So number one, track trends to adapt your path, and that is just a more concise way of getting to some of the finer points that we discussed before. Keep your eyes open to keep your ears at a listening pace for what is going out there, not only within the field, which gets into the second point, but also in allied fields as well, because then that can have an impact on yourself that can be transformative. Number two, being able to embrace adjacency and industry parallels. This is where you can be thinking creatively or to be thinking of a potential industry or job or industry news that may not on its face seem like it has a relationship, but maybe it does have a lesson embedded in there that can be very valuable. And then number three, to gather your assets, yourself included. And so here's where, we really are talking about consider everything that you have to offer, not just what's on the job responsibilities and requirements page, but beyond. And also this sense that this is a job that you can perform in well, that you feel confident in, that you're excited about. It is not always necessary or required to have every single bullet list item reflected, and employers understand that. And it kind of gets back to what we were saying before, where sometimes it can be a bit of a negotiation to finalize what the final position ultimately will be, melding what you have to offer with what the employer is looking for.
Mhm. Well said. So, thank you to the attendees, and of course, thanks to my presenting partner, Ryan Donaldson. We did go a little extra long, but I think it's because we had so much good stuff to share with you. We do want to spend a few minutes at the end here and at least open it up for some questions. So, just a reminder, you can use the chat box to type in your questions, or we do have our contact information on the next slide that we'll leave up for about 5 minutes or so as you type in your questions. Ryan and I will be around to answer. And then, of course, we encourage and invite you to connect with us in our various social media locations. And just again, thank you so much to our attendees, and thank you, Ryan, for bringing your thoughts and your discussion. It's enjoyable as always. So thank you.
Likewise, always a pleasure to collaborate with you, Rachel. And thank you for attending.